Alright, so we're going to get started with some Black Star India ink. I've got it on a plastic palette that's clipped to my sketchbook, and as you can hear in the background, I'm working on location by Lake Superior. So you're going to hear some birds and motorboats every now and then, and lots of water splashing up on the rocks. Alright, so I'm loading up the palette with a little bit of clean water. I'm making at least a couple diluted puddles. After a little bit of time, the actual cup of water that I've got there will be a nice little gray tone as well. As I'm making the first marks on the paper, it's important to know that off camera I flooded in a little section of the area of the paper with some clean water, and that allows the brush strokes that are filled with a little bit of the gray tone to kind of melt in and blend out. It gives you a nice soft, almost atmospheric edge, and what I'm looking at up there is the horizon line where the water is meeting the sky. It's very bright, overcast day, lots of clouds in the sky, but that edge in the background is fuzzier, softer. And I'm letting it kind of fade down and scrub out and potentially create a couple marks in there that may feel more liquidy or feel as if they're describing something important with the water. The other thing I'd note would be there is a pencil drawing there. It is very faint, you can just barely make it out. I've done it in a blue water-soluble colored pencil. That means that the pencil's going to disappear a little bit. I would say my drawings are subtle. There's not a lot of drawing. I spent maybe 10 minutes on the drawing, just getting everything kind of figured out on the page. Not drawing every little bit. I like to draw with the brush quite a bit, actually. And so the pencil drawing is more or less the big shapes and not all the little details. I'll get the details with the brush. But the blue pencil, if any of it remained, and since this is an illustration class, I can talk about that. If any of it remained, it's easy to remove in Photoshop, because ultimately, as an illustrator, the final piece would be the print or the piece in some sort of publication. So that blue pencil ends up being very easy to remove. A lot of comic artists use it. Blue and red pencils tend to be pretty common as an underdrawing. But if you use a graphite pencil, just know that as you add some liquid over top of it, it's likely going to remain and feel kind of embedded in the drawing. So do it very light. Use a 2H, an H, an HB at the softest, really, unless you want the pencil work to be part of the drawing, or ink wash in this case. Now I've moved down to an area where there's a lot of deep darks, and I'm laying in the first sort of 50% washes as you see me fighting with a mosquito there. We have a pretty deep darkest dark in this area, and really this is just knocking back the paper white. I've established sort of the brightest moments up in the sky in the water, and now I'm flip-flopping right down to the darkest dark to kind of get that process started. This is a chunky, flat, square brush. The round brushes that are on the supply list are certainly capable of doing what I'm doing here. It's just a different kind of tool. You'll see me use a round brush later for some more detail. Sorry, I'm off camera right now. I'm not doing a lot of crazy things over there, just getting some of the water shapes established. This big chunky shape is a cast shadow, and you'll see one of the things that happens with ink wash is that the overlap as it goes over that water shape down there will darken. And so you'll want to be aware of that. That's a benefit here because obviously along the water line you're going to be able to see underneath, and it deepens and darkens some of the values. So playing with that sort of natural tendency is something that you want to be aware of. What you'll find with the ink wash is that it tends not to be super dark. As it dries, it's going to lighten, and even if you take a deep dark wash and go over an area a few times, it seems to reach a point where it can't go much darker. And I've always got my cup of water nearby. There's a paper towel in my lap or in my hand, and I'll use that periodically to dry off the brush and change the fluid, sort of how wet the brush is. So I have more control over that. It's right in there as I'm going around that little brighter shape in there, which is a rock. I wanted to soften that edge and let it fade up a little bit. So bringing in a damp brush above, just to kind of feather it upward. And I'm going around and hitting some of the darks. You'll see this area is certainly a damp passage where I drop some of those darker colors in and let them just kind of do what they need to do. And as I see it maybe not bleeding into it enough, then I'll bring kind of a drier brush and swipe over a little bit and spread it out. And here's where I get to have a little fun, laying in a pretty loose wash here. Take a look at this whole area of the rocks, and I'm going to darken the whole thing. Use a value key to establish what's the brightest bright in here and wash over the entirety of it. Not looking for a perfect clean flat wash. In fact, it's a rock. It's going to have a lot of variation to it. And so a little bit of irregularity and bleeds or blooms in the liquid of the media are a good thing. In fact, you'll see me do some dry brush later on to kind of introduce more textures at various times. So this is the fun part where you just get to play and see what happens with the media. It's hard to tell from the actual painting at this point, but that little spot right now is it's a background piece. So I want it to be, a little lighter than the rock in the front. It's bleeding into it right now, but that'll change a little later. But I'm looking at the edge, and I want that edge to be a little softer. So as it transitions into the water, it's faded, it's fuzzy, and deepen it as we step forward in space. So just a real quick contrast relationship there to obviously push back the dark, have the rock itself cast shadow even, and establish kind of a foreground, middle ground, and background where that horizon line is. Again, here I'm looking at essentially toning the local color, local value, creating a key for this rock, which is going to be deeper and darker. I'm going to play with the shape that the brush allows to happen. I'll not get too obsessed with it being exactly like what's happening out on that rock in front of me. But play with the natural abstraction you can get from the brush stroke. respond to what you see on the paper. Sometimes the brush will look more improved nature. And this is just a first wash. These are these washes will dry lighter. It's India ink. It's going to be a permanent surface or a permanent layer. So once that's dry, you have at least until the paper gives up, depending upon the quality of the paper. You can do 10 washes even on an area without it really showing overwork. If you're getting some of the cheaper paper, then you may want to try to hit those washes a little darker the first time, because they will start to pill up a little bit, and the paper and the fibers will show that softness that doesn't give you a good edge after a while. And I suppose, speaking of paper, this is a 140-pound sketchbook of watercolor paper, meaning that the paper is relatively thick. It's got a good snap to it if you pluck the edge, and it's by Pentalic. So it's, in my experience, a little bit better than the Moleskine watercolor paper. That paper won't take as many washes. And I have it taped around on the edges to give me a nice clean border when I've removed the tape. And it also secures it to the other pages in the sketchbook, so it's not flapping around in the wind. It'll really just kind of help it lay flat after a while. Here in the foreground, again, I'm thinking of toning it so that it's not white anymore. Really, again, the brightest things are the water in the background and the sky, maybe a reflection around the lower right corner. But this is going to be a brighter region, so it's kind of a bright mid-tone. It's going to be darker in the middle and then lighter in the background. So I've got really three big value shapes, and then lots of little shapes that break up in between them. Anytime you go back into a wash like I'm doing up there at the top, make sure that your brush is a little drier than what was already down on the paper. And I've cut away for a moment here to let the actual wash dry. And it's always good to get up and stretch, take a look at your work from a distance, see how those values brighten in this case as well. And as you rub your hand across the surface, be aware of what might be damp. If you touch it with the back of your hand and it still feels cool, then give it a little bit longer before you go in there with anything really important that you don't want to kind of bleed out in a wash. And so really now it's about pushing in some deeper darks. There's a second level or layer of rock here that ultimately has a little distinction between the foreground, another foot, and then the big taller rocks. And there's a little kind of entry point for the viewer's eye, that diagonal around near my brush right now, and it kind of points it into the composition and up through that stone that's peeking out of the water in the middle. Now we're going to start to see things speed up here just to save some time. And really going around nowhere near this fast in real life. Keep an eye on the bugs scraping across the paper and gently flick them off if you can. Otherwise just let them crawl around, because more than likely when you least want it to happen, you'll accidentally squish that bug and it'll be smeared across your surface, and you don't want that. But these are, in some cases, third washes over a region, and the brush is going to kind of split across and maybe leave a little textural mark there, here and there. But continually going back and forth between the idea of what's cast shadow, where's the shadow side on the figure. And so we're starting to kind of delineate now as a big flat area, and then dropping in the shadow side of that top portion, a little bit of a cast shadow. And I was playing with this little brighter shape in the middle of that, and I think I end up getting rid of that just because it was too complicated. And then some deeper creases or cracks in the rock that become landmarks. Because I haven't created a really strong drawing, I do need to have a few things to kind of return to and hang my hat on to say, okay, I know where I'm at because it's close to this line and I can continue to go back and forth between it. But I wouldn't call them details so much as it's a big giant shape there at the end, and these become puzzle pieces now. And so when I'm more confident about that, then you can start to push a little form. There's a little bit of a dark shadow side out there, and you may start to see this rock start to look like a head, an animal, a dog, or some kind of form. That is one of the things that attracted me to it. Something kind of interesting and unexpected, and I think it shows up at the end still. Something that would keep me interested in looking at it. And I'm really trying to continue to push and contrast around this stone that's pushing out of the water there. You can kind of see an edge underneath the water and a couple darker moments around it. I'll keep going back and forth between that. And then just not to get hung up on one area too long. Bounce around. Obviously things need to dry, and I don't want to continue to work into an area too much, or you'll lose your edge. You'll lose the sharpness compared to a softness. You'll start to break the paper fibers up a little bit. Here I'm switching brushes now, just to try a skinnier brush. It's still flat, I can still get a decent line. I don't end up really using it too long, but it ends up giving me a little more control in a few of these areas here, where I wouldn't want a big shape. Really, that's one of the important points about brush sizes, is work as large as you can in any given area. So it's very easy to say, reach for the smallest brush because you can get the sharpest detail, and that's defeating the purpose here at this point. I'm not into the details yet. I'm into big shapes and now subsequent divisions within those big shapes, whether they be cast shadows or here this little middle area needs to be darker, and so unifying it as a whole. But it has 3 values on it right now. So there are kind of planes and forms that receive light and fall into shadow. And as you move around, that helps balance the picture, so it doesn't feel like you spend an hour on one area and all of a sudden you've got 15 minutes to finish the thing up and you don't have enough time to do it all. Balance that area around. Nice big dark. This needed to hold the foreground a little bit more. It's still not going to be as detailed as that larger rock head, if you will, on the right side, where I put a little bit more contrast at the end. But pushing, again, kind of a planar change into shadow, into midtone, into light even. And here we've got a round brush now, so I've switched to that, and I think I end up using this brush for the remainder of the drawing. And it does become a little bit of a linear application now, a little more detail with this brush now, making very specific dark value shapes and changes, and pushing a little more emphasis on some of the creases and lines as we get into that. But again, pushing into this area here around the stone, much darker. And accentuating the value of the water, because it was really one of the darker spaces in the picture. You'll certainly see me put some dark ink like I just did there, and then bring a wet brush back over top of it to kind of paint it out. It's sort of like mixing on the paper, like you might do in an oil painting, which just keeps it more spontaneous. Because we're working on location, I like to let some of the freshness of the space dictate how I paint sometimes. So it's nowhere near as mechanical, much looser than an application I might do in a studio environment, where things are moving. I'm not trying to work quick. I'm bringing a little less control than would be in the studio. Let some things just happen. You can hear that brush kind of scraping across a more dry brush. That'll introduce a little more texture, and since the variety of marks that you make will create some interest for the viewer, and I'm working with a rock, it's important to play with some of that. Later on you'll see some speckling, where I kind of flick the brush at the surface and get little drops and little spots to just speckle the rock surface a little bit, introduce that texture. But for the most part, we're going to take some of this remaining time and just let it happen. I'm going to add some details. You'll see lots of lines. I'm going to be continually turning the form where things need to feel brighter in the top half and darker as it fades under, as well as starting to kind of help decipher what's happening on this left side of the rock, where one portion needs to feel like it's in front of another portion, so I'll drop something darker as I'm doing right now. So you'll see the detail level kind of slowly increase here over the next 10 minutes, and then we'll wrap it up with a final look at the piece. One more thing before we wrap it up would be the lines that are introduced here. They may vary in color or value a little bit, but even if they don't, I'm ready to go back to that water cup, and when it is too dark, I'll blend it out, or where I need it to be deeply recessed and kind of dark immediately, and then fades out around where light might be bouncing in and filtering around. You just scrape that water cup edge with your brush so it's not completely soaked with water, and you bring it in kind of damp, and it'll stretch it out a little bit, expand it, and you can feather it out with the cleaner water. But again, I'm going to just continue to add details and hopefully reach a point where it feels more or less balanced in terms of how complex certain areas are, and quiet or restrained or even out of focus feeling other areas might be. I'm really taking those final marks to kind of bridge some of the gaps between areas of sharpness where some of the lines are, they've dried, maybe with more contrast than I wanted to. And because of that sharpness, they come forward off of the gray, sort of amorphous, more soft blended areas. And I want those almost to stitch it together now, the lines, the cracks in the rocks. They're going to kind of pull some of the forms together a little bit more and give it a little more authority, if you will. But we're wrapping up. The contrast level is getting pretty close to where I want it. When you look at a photo of it, as you can see throughout this piece, I'm really effectively changing what might be visible in the picture. The photo loses a lot of the subtlety in the shadow sides, and I'm looking into those shadows, and I'm blowing out the brights in the background a little bit to create a little more depth, more atmosphere. So it's not something that feels necessarily photographic, but hopefully authentic with regard to how it feels as a piece. So you can see obviously the background rock there, much darker. And that changed as I was sitting there. There was a shadow, again, cast from that central region onto the bigger head of the rock. But on location, it took, I think, about an hour and 10 minutes to do the actual piece, maybe 10 minutes to do the sketch beforehand. So besides the setup of my tripod and all that stuff, maybe 2 hours on location, and then we're ready to take this one home. And so we'll take a good look at a detailed scan, and then we'll be done. So here's the final piece, scanned at home. You can see the tape edges are nice and clean. When you do that, just make sure you burnish down really good around the inside edge. And if you have any trouble removing it, something that can help is to actually use a hairdryer and heat the tape up a little bit. Don't burn it or anything, but heat it up just a little bit, and the residue will help pull off of the paper. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed the ink wash demonstration, and that you have some fun trying a new media or a new approach to India ink by introducing the water with it. Thank you, everyone.